Karl Marx. Part 4, Class Struggle and State. The occasional piece, Civil War in France, written in 1871, contains some significant remarks by Marx on the estimation of the state. He writes, "The centralized state power, with its ubiquitous organs of standing army, police, bureaucracy, clergy, and judicature, organs wrought after the plan of a systematic and hierarchic division of labour, originates from the days of absolute monarchy, serving nascent middle-class society as a mighty weapon in its struggles against feudalism. During the subsequent regimes, the government became not only a hotbed of huge national debts and crushing taxes, with its irresistible allurements of place, pelf, and patronage. It became not only the bone of contention between the rival factions and adventurers of the ruling classes." There is much here with which the anarchist can agree. The state is predicated upon a division of labour. It assumes a monopoly of legitimate violence, since it assumes that a free market in the provision of such services is bound to be destructive. Also, states have consistently allied themselves with sectional interests, bankers, rent-seeking industrialists, and the like. In his critique of the Gotha Programme of 1875, Marx commented on the proposed programme for the Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. A number of points of interest emerged from Marx's comments. In response to the programme's call for equality, Marx notes that in the transitional stage between the existing economic, social and political order and the establishment of communist society, equality is unrealizable. But when communist society has been established, after the subjection of individuals to the divisions of labour, and thereby the antithesis between mental and physical labour has disappeared, after labour has become not merely a means to live, but the foremost need in life, after the multifarious development of individuals has grown along with their productive powers, and all the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the limited horizon of bourgeois right be wholly transcended, and society can inscribe on its banner, "From each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs." The programme had committed the German Workers' Party to strive for a free state. Marx wants to know what such a beast would be. He writes, "Freedom consists in transforming the state from an agency superior to society into one thoroughly subordinated to it." In a communist society, what will be the status and function of the state? To this question, Marx replies significantly, "Between capitalist and communist society, there is a period of revolutionary transformation of one into the other. There is also, corresponding, a period of political transition, in which the state can be nothing else but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat." Two particular targets of Marx's attack within the programme are noteworthy. The programme called for universal and compulsory school attendance. This seems not unlike Marx's own call in the Communist Manifesto for free education for all children in public schools. However, Marx treats this aspect of the Gotha programme with utter scorn, holding that elementary state education is completely objectionable and calling for the separation of education from the influence of both church and state. The programme also called for the prohibition of child labour, and here Marx notes that such a prohibition would be incompatible with the existence of large-scale industry and hence an empty, pious wish. Moreover, if such a policy were to be implemented, he thinks its effect would be reactionary because, provided there are appropriate safety measures for children, an early combination of productive labour with instruction is one of the most powerful means for transforming present-day society. Herr Eugen Dühring's Revolution in Science, more often known simply as Anti-Dühring, was written by Engels, with some contributions by Marx. Leaving aside the crude personal attack on Dühring, the essay recapitulates the Marxist materialist theory of history, a history governed by laws and the theory of surplus value, and presents them as the two great discoveries of Marx by which socialism became a science. In the economic section of the work, which seems to come from the hand of Marx, we find again the idea that modern industry has called two opposed classes into being, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The forces of production created by the bourgeoisie cannot be controlled by them, and if catastrophe is to be avoided, there must be a revolution of the mode of production and distribution. When the time is right, the revolution will come, and with it the end of opposing classes. I said above that the libertarian anarchists and others have no fundamental disagreement with the idea of class analysis just as such, and so don't find themselves in opposition to Marx on this point. The contentious issue is which human beings comprise which class. According to Hans Hermann Hoppe, Marxists believe that the history of mankind is in essence the history of struggles between pairs of classes, that the dominant class exploits the dominated class, that the dominant class employs the coercive force of the state to protect the relations of production or property arrangements favourable to the dominant class, which it does by means of laws that privilege the dominant class, together with the promulgation and maintenance of an ideology that legitimates these arrangements. That within the dominant class there exists an internal tendency towards centralization and concentration, and an external tendency towards conflict between the increasingly integrated groups. And that this centralization and concentration and competition will lead to the emergence of a revolutionary class consciousness and the withering away of the state, and the replacement of coercive government of man by man with an administration of things, all of this resulting in unprecedented economic prosperity. Hoppe believes that Marxism is essentially correct in all 5 points, except for the small matter of misidentifying the classes. Because of this misidentification, based on an unsustainable, Hoppe calls it absurd, theory of exploitation, Hoppe believes that Marxism has brought the 5 claims into disrepute. In his historical excursus, Marx correctly identifies slavery as a form of exploitation and, similarly, the feudal relationship between lord and peasant. And he is suitably indignant about the plunder and violence and conquest employed in establishing and maintaining these relationships. He is similarly indignant about the violence involved in the appropriation of colonies. So far, so good. Unfortunately, Marx goes on to portray the employer-worker relationship as similarly exploitative. Hoppe believes, and I agree with him, that these situations are entirely different. Hoppe writes, Marx is engaged in a trick. In engaging in historical investigations and arousing the reader's indignation regarding the brutalities underlying the formation of many capitalist fortunes, he actually sidesteps the issue at hand. He distracts from the fact that his thesis is really an entirely different one, namely, that even if one were to have a clean capitalism, so to speak, that is, one in which the original appropriation of capital were the result of nothing else but homesteading, work, and saving, the capitalist who hired labour to be employed with this capital would nonetheless be engaged in exploitation. Now, as has already been shown, the labour theory of value is economically obsolete, so that to the extent that a theory of exploitation depends upon it, its case is not proven. If exploitation cannot be explained by the labour theory of value, it must be explained by factor Z, whatever that may be. But an analysis of the phenomenon of uncoerced exchange shows us that no such factor Z can be found. Apart from any other deficiencies it may have, the Marxist analysis of exchange attaches no importance to the notion of time. But time is an essential feature of human life as a whole, and is no less a significant feature of exchange. Just as a shopper who pays more for butter in one store than he would be obliged to pay in another is not necessarily irrational, provided we take into account that it's not just the butter itself which is purchased, but the service, the splendour or otherwise of the store, the convenience, and so on. So too, time enters into exchanges. Other things being equal, we prefer something now to that same thing later. The worker is paid now for goods whose value to the employer is only realized later. We can now see why the worker enters into an agreement that on the Marxist analysis is baffling. The labourer enters the agreement because, given his time preference, he prefers a smaller amount of present goods over a larger future one. And the capitalist enters it because, given his time preference, he has a reverse preference order and ranks a larger future amount of goods more highly than a smaller present one. As is the case with all non-coerced exchanges, both parties benefit. So then, is exploitation possible at all if the Marxist account is rejected? Well, yes, but for different reasons. A exploits B if A uses B's resources without B's permission, whether these are B's external resources or, in the extreme case, B himself. Slavery is the exploitation of the slave because the slave's property in himself is appropriated by the slave owner. Serfdom is exploitation because the serf's property in the land he has homesteaded is appropriated by the feudal lord. Exploitation is not merely some psychological dissatisfaction one may experience from an exchange. We often obtain less than we would like from an exchange. I'm not paid as much as I would like, or my house sells for less than I would like. But as long as we are free to exchange or not exchange, and our property is not simply appropriated, then we cannot complain that we were exploited. Once at a concession stand at a rugby game, I overheard someone complain of being ripped off because he was asked to pay €5 for a hot dog. Rip off is a synonym for exploitation. But of course, he wasn't obliged to buy the hot dog. He wouldn't have died if he had waited an hour or two to buy it somewhere else. And whether he knew it or not, his purchase of the hot dog testified to the fact that he was judging the consumption of the hot dog to be worth more than €5. Actions speak louder than words. Exploitation, then, properly understood, takes place whenever one person appropriates resources that he himself has neither homesteaded, nor saved, nor produced, nor acquired from another by legitimate exchange. Thieves exploit those upon whom they predate. So too robbers and fraudsters. Unlike free and uncoerced exchange, exploitation is zero-sum. The exploiter's gain is the exploited's loss. We can then divide mankind into two classes: those who live by homesteading, producing and exchanging, and those who live by exploiting them. It is here that the fundamental truth of class conflict lies, and that is why the Marxist account of class conflict has a ring of truth. The whole of human history is a record of the conflict between producers and predators. Marxism is correct to hold that class conflict is the key to the analysis of human society. Marxism is wrong to identify the conflict as obtaining between employer and worker, and wrong not to see where it really is located, between the state and the state-supported entities and the rest of society. It is true that Marxism portrays the state as the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, and sees the close connection between big business and big finance, but it misunderstands fundamentally the nature of that relationship. The cosy relationship that exists between the state and the beneficiaries of corporate welfare doesn't exist because the state is the resolute defender of private property, but because the state is the dispenser of privileges and monopolies and rebates and bailouts, all of which protects its cronies from the full impact of free market competition. The relationship is particularly friendly between the state and the banks in their cooperative efforts to establish and maintain legalized counterfeiting. By offering to cut the banking elite in on its own counterfeiting machinations and allowing them to counterfeit on top of its own counterfeited notes under a regime of fractional reserve banking, the state can easily reach this goal and establish a system of state monopolized money and cartelized banking controlled by the central bank. And through this direct counterfeiting connection with the banking system, and by extension the bank's major clients, the ruling class in fact extends far beyond the state apparatus to the very nerve centres of civil society. Not that much different, at least in appearance, from the picture that Marxists like to paint of the cooperation between banking business elites and the state. When the exploiting class is large and the exploited class relatively small, the exploitative relationship can be initiated and sustained by violence. When the exploiting class is small compared to the exploited class, then the maintenance of exploitation cannot be sustained just by violence or by the threat of violence. In this case, it is essential that the exploited class must come to accept that the status quo is in order, and to that end, an appropriate ideology must be promulgated and widely accepted. That ideology typically contains a theory of democracy, constitutions, elections, a notion of representation, the necessity for state coercive institutions to preserve law and order, and the necessity for the forcible redistribution of property to protect the poor, and the general dispensing of goodies to all and sundry, cleverly disguising the fact that these goodies are paid for by someone else, and so on. often accompanied by an historical account that conceals more than it reveals, all of this being accompanied by the steady and remunerative work of the exploiter's willing little helpers, civil servants, the print and electronic media, schools and churches. It's not necessary that those who are exploited enthusiastically accept the status quo. All the better for the exploiters if they do. It's enough if they passively acquiesce in it, accepting its inevitability as expressed in the common but false saying that only two things are inevitable in life: death and taxes. The emergence of the modern state is testimony to the successful deployment of an effective ideology, not least because, as a result of the cultural acceptance by many people of Marxism, people look for exploitation in the wrong place and fail to see the exploitation that is taking place in front of their eyes. In order for the state to function, the mass of the people has to believe in its legitimacy. To that end, the state employs a class of professional apologists and controls the means of propaganda, often through dominance of the education system. The task of the state apologist is to convince the public that what the state does is not crime on a gigantic scale, but something necessary and vital that must be supported and obeyed. In return for their services, the apologists are rewarded with power and status, and allowed to share in the booty obtained from the masses. We are brought up to believe in the legitimacy of the state. Our state-sponsored education confirms us in this belief. Everything around us in society supports this belief, and nothing appears to count against it. The belief in the legitimacy of the state is all the more effectively planted in the minds of its citizens if it is never actually argued for or justified, because that might raise debts, but simply conveyed inchoately as a foundational principle. Thus communicated, just as death is an inescapable fact of natural life, so too does the state and its legitimacy appear to be a fact of social life. Such is the power of being first in the field, positioning in advertising terms, that the state can literally get away with murder if it can foster the notion that what it does is legitimate. Murray Rothbard claims that the man on the Clapham omnibus, after centuries of propaganda, has been imbued with the idea that the government is his legitimate sovereign, and that it would be wicked or mad to refuse to obey its dictates. The legitimacy of the state has been effectively and insidiously communicated to all by the state's apologists in the churches, the schools, the universities, the press, aided and abetted by all the trappings of legitimacy: flags, rituals, ceremonies, awards, constitutions, and so on. The post-2008 financial crisis had the incidental effect of throwing a lifebuoy to Keynesian economic theories and, changing metaphors, allowing Marxism to be taken off the life support machine it had been on for a considerable time. The crisis is widely touted as a crisis of capitalism, and thus is taken to show that Marx was right after all. This belief has found expression in many places: newspaper articles, posters, the internet, television and radio programs. But perhaps the most egregious and entertaining semi-scholarly expression of this view is Terry Eagleton's 2011 book, aptly titled Why Marx Was Right. I choose to look at Eagleton's book not because it is the most serious work of scholarship. On the contrary, it is a 200-plus page piece of invective, sometimes amusing, sometimes silly, but written with panache, but because it says what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. It is a remarkable demonstration of the capacity of dead horses to regain life once they cease to be flogged, and so should encourage us to flog dead horses vigorously and ceaselessly. In this book, Eagleton takes 10 common criticisms of Marx and attempts to rebut them one by one. The criticisms he considers, rephrased for brevity, are: 1. Marxism is irrelevant. It might have been relevant in the 19th century, but not in our post-industrial Western societies. 2. The practical result of Marxism has been mass murder, terror, and tyranny. Less dramatically, socialism means a lack of freedom and a lack of material goods. 3. Marxism is a form of determinism, a secular version of providence. As such, it is inimical to human freedom and dignity. 4. Marxism is utopian and out of touch with social and political reality. 5. Marxism is just a form of economic reductionism. 6. Marx was a materialist and an anti-humanist. His materialism and anti-humanism leads directly to the likes of Stalin. 7. Marx's class analysis is out of date. The revolutionary worker is a figment of the Marxist imagination. 8. Marxists advocate violent political action, revolution instead of evolution. The end justifies the means, regardless of whatever mayhem may ensue. 9. Marxism believes in an all-powerful state. Wherever Marxism has been put into practice, the socialists in power have ruled despotically. Party over people, the state over party, and a monstrous dictator over all. And 10. Marxism has been superseded by feminism, environmentalism, anti-globalization, and the like. The contribution of Marxism to such movements has been at best marginal. Not all of these criticisms are equally germane to my project in this recording. For example, I'm not really worried about Marxism's alleged supersession by feminism and so on, but some criticisms clearly are. Let's see what Eagleton has to say. In responding to the first criticism, the supposed irrelevancy of Marxism, the target Eagleton's are is very often the target of anarchists are as well. What he attacks as capitalism is what I and other libertarian anarchists would portray as crony capitalism: big business, big labour, big finance, big X, all cronies of the state. In fact, and in brief, Eagleton makes the common Marxist mistake of objecting to things that are in fact objectionable, but mistaking the cause of their objectionability. In this case, Eagleton makes the common and seemingly ineradicable mistake of identifying crony capitalism with the operation of the free market. He writes that Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher helped to dismantle traditional manufacture, shackle the labour movement, let the market rip, strengthen the repressive arm of the state, and champion a new social philosophy known as barefaced greed. It's hard to know where to start to comment on this explosion of R, but I really only want to make one obvious point. Whatever Reagan and Thatcher may have done during their respective tenure of offices, the one thing they did not do was to let the market rip. In another passage, Eagleton deprecates spectacular inequalities of wealth and power, imperial warfare, intensified exploitation, and increasingly repressive state. From a libertarian perspective, inequalities of wealth aren't by themselves morally or legally problematic. In fact, it's hard to see how it could be so for anyone who thinks about the matter seriously. Consider the following scenario. In the country of Plutopolis, half the people have an income of $1 million a year, and the other an income of $500,000. One half of the people are twice as rich as the other half. The income disparity is stark. In the country of Miserarium, on the other hand, everyone has exactly the same income of $763 per year. Ask yourself where you would rather be. If you answer Miserarium, I would suspect your honesty, or your sanity, or both. So, unless one is motivated simply by envy and would prefer to have very little provided only that others were no better off, the moral and legal issue isn't inequality just as such. It is whether such inequality is the product of aggression, or expropriation, or theft, or robbery, or fraud, or whether it is the result of the free exchange of goods and services. Anarchists are also opposed to intensified exploitation, but unlike Marxists, they do not locate such exploitation in the operation of a free market, but in the nexus of state, banking, finance, and all other beneficiaries of corporate welfare. And of course, anarchists also deprecate the increasingly repressive state. Alistair Heath remarks, real business people who make their money in open competitive markets are entitled to their vast wealth, but crony capitalists who rely on state privileges don't deserve our support. The left and the right have both got it wrong here. The former wrongly attacked all inequality, the latter wrongly defend all of it. The blunt reality is that all societies are highly unequal, even supposedly communist ones. What really matters is the source of the inequality. Are the wealthy rich because they looted everybody else, as was inevitably the case in feudal pre-commercial societies? Or are they prosperous because they profited from serving the needs of others in a competitive market? Is a society open to new talent and ideas and encouraging of social mobility? Or is it controlled by a small economic and political aristocracy that doesn't let anybody else climb to the top? Whether inequality is good or bad depends on the answer to these questions. Merely bashing the top 0.1%, has become fashionable once more, is to substitute clear thinking for destructive, simplistic demagoguery. Eagleton concedes, how could he not, that what he calls capitalism has produced untold wealth in some parts of the world. This claim is evident, not to mention having Marx's imprimatur. But, Eagleton thinks, such wealth comes at a cost of genocide, famine, imperialism, and the slave trade. Once again, a libertarian can agree in part with Eagleton's point. Aggression against other peoples has historically been part of the changes that have taken place since 1750. But aggression is no part of a free market. It is part of crony capitalism that, with the state as its friend, is only too happy to use aggression to attain its ends. Hans Hermann Hoppe grants the essential correctness of the Marxist thesis that much or even most of the initial capitalist property is the result of plunder, enclosure and conquest, finding himself in surprising agreement with Terry Eagleton, who writes that Marx writes with scarcely suppressed outrage in Capital of the bloody protracted process by which the English peasantry were driven from the land. It is this history of violent expropriation which lies beneath the tranquillity of the English rural landscape. And Hoppe goes on to note that the export of capitalism to the Third World has been accompanied by force and violence. Once again, however, it must be clearly stated that the free market is not at all the same thing as crony capitalism. Alistair Heath again. There are two ways businesses and investors can make money legally. The first is by providing goods and services that people want, by working out correctly what assets will be in most demand, or by investing capital in successful projects. All activities that boost economic growth, increase employment, help develop poor economies, and lift living standards. The second way that businesses and investors can make money is by getting the government to rig markets in their favour, by erecting barriers to entry to restrict competition, by providing them with cheap credit, or by allowing them to use their political connections to grab contracts and other privileges. These gains are not the fruit of value-adding economic activity. Rather than helping to grow the economy, they often merely redistribute wealth. Eagleton manifests the academic's customary disdain of profit, regarding it in orthodox Marxist fashion as an expression of acquisitive self-interest, a morally suspect motive, and also again, as usual, seeing it in zero-sum terms. If you need to accumulate capital more or less from scratch, then the most effective way of doing so, however brutal, is through the profit motive. Avid self-interest is likely to pile up wealth with remarkable speed, though it is likely to amass spectacular poverty at the same time. Well, theft will amass capital very effectively, much more effectively and rapidly than making a profit in business, but no libertarian will endorse theft as a legitimate method of capital accumulation. Profits can only be made if a seller of goods and services is supplying what people actually want to buy, and where, pray tell, is the brutality in that? The making of profit does not, in a world in which uncoerced exchange is doubly positive sum, result in anyone's poverty. Eagleton's writing here is more impassioned than reasoned. In another passage, Eagleton again concedes that capitalism is astonishingly productive and generates enormous wealth, but argues that it does so in a way that cannot help putting it beyond the reach of most of its citizens. If we're talking about the free market, that term being simply a placeholder for the nexus of uncoerced interactions between willing participants and not some reified process, it's not clear why the generation of enormous wealth for X, Y, and Z cannot help impoverishing A, B, and C. Unless, that is, we make the mistake of thinking that there is a fixed quantity of wealth, so that the more X, Y, and Z have, the less is available for A, B, and C. But Eagleton surely cannot think of wealth in a steady-state way, as he has admitted the generative and productive power of capitalism. So why then does capitalism necessarily result in wealth for some and poverty for others? That cannot happen on the free market, free exchange being mutually beneficial, but of course it can and does happen in a system of crony capitalism. There is much more moralizing in this chapter of Eagleton's. Together with a frank and welcome admission that Maoism and Stalinism were botched, bloody experiments, There is a significant amount of special pleading and excusing and blaming of others for the botching and of the blood. I hate to point this out, but this is a justification not much above the level of two wrongs make a right. Later in his book, Eagleton writes, "In its brief but bloody career, Marxism has involved a hideous amount of violence. Both Stalin and Mao Zedong were mass murderers on an almost unimaginable scale. It would be hard to deny the truth of Eagleton's observation, though some have tried. But he immediately goes on to say that while few Marxists today do in fact attempt to deny the enormity of Stalinism and Maoism, many non-Marxists would defend, say, the destruction of Dresden or Hiroshima. Whether or not anyone, non-Marxist or otherwise, would defend the atrocities of Dresden or Hiroshima is entirely irrelevant to the infamy of Stalinism and Maoism. In fact, libertarian anarchists, and free marketeers generally, are fully as opposed to imperial warfare as is Eagleton, not least because they know such warfare is paid for in money and in the destruction of property and lives by those who work and produce in every society, and not by those who live parasitically off the proceeds of their labour. Objectionable as this line of argument is, it is scarcely more objectionable than the economic naivety demonstrated in Eagleton's charming but foolish idea of an economy that is neither centrally planned nor market governed. In this unfocused division, resources are allocated by negotiation between whom and whom, and policy is determined by representative assemblies through a process of devolved and detailed planning. What is produced and how it is produced will be determined by social need rather than the private profit. Under capitalism, Eagleton remarks, we are deprived of the power to decide whether we want to produce more hospitals or more breakfast cereals. Under socialism, this freedom would be regularly exercised. One doesn't know whether to laugh or to weep. Without markets and a real, not just notional price system, there is no rational way to determine production or allocation priorities. Central planning of a complex economy hasn't, doesn't, and cannot work. Summary. Much of the power of Marxism comes from its status as an ersatz religion. The motive force of Marx's writing was a deep revulsion at certain aspects of modern life. His passion didn't arise from any concern with abstract economics, but from a visceral rejection of the exploitation he believed to be the inevitable accompaniment to capitalism. The Communist Manifesto owes no little of its prominence to its brevity, its clarity, and its forceful writing. What has struck every reader with surprise, or even astonishment, is the praise Marx lavishes on the achievements of the bourgeoisie in the Communist Manifesto. But however spectacular and energetic the achievements of the bourgeoisie, its very success contains the seeds of its own destruction. Marx's Capital is a book that should not be read in its entirety. Whatever its literary merits or demerits, there can be no doubt of its theoretical shortcomings. Capital makes extensive use of a network of interrelated concepts: use value, exchange value, surplus value, labour, labour power, and of course, capital. The cornerstone of this conceptual complex is the notion of the labour theory of value. One of the ideas central to Marxism is that economics grounds politics and not the other way around. The whole enterprise that Marx has undertaken in Capital is fundamentally wrong-headed. The value of a commodity is nothing objective and is not to be found in the commodity. The idea of the class struggle is central to Marx's thought. The history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggles. Libertarian anarchists have no fundamental disagreement with class analysis. The issue in contention is which group of human beings comprise which class. Mankind can be divided into two classes: those who live by homesteading, production, and exchanging, and those who live by exploiting them. It is here that the fundamental truth of the class conflict lies. The whole of human history is a record of the conflict between producers and predators. Marxism is correct to hold that class conflict is key to the analysis of human society, but it goes wrong in not seeing that the relevant classes are the state and state-supported entities on the one hand, and the rest of society on the other.